morning and welcome to Asia Gaming Brief's Face-to-Face series. Today I'm talking with Geoff Wohlsen, who's a partner in Wohlsen Consulting. It's an Australian firm that focuses on the country's pubs and clubs and hospitality sectors. We're going to be talking about the recovery in Australia and some of the challenges facing the club sector. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. You've just put out some research on the latest figures from Queensland and the pubs and clubs in May, which were pretty strong. Have you seen that continue into June?
Yeah, I have. You mentioned May figures, and they're 14% up on last May and a good 30-odd% up on what we'd expect for a pre-COVID May to be. June has continued in a similar vein. June is around about 10% up on last June. And also around 20% up on what you would think would be a decent month pre-COVID. So, yes, it has continued into June. And quite frankly, we expect it to sort of creep into July as well. In August, we have such a thing here in Australia as tax time. And the Australian Tax Office releases its tax returns in late July and August. And a lot of that money finds its way into entertainment.
Right. I hadn't realised that you were quite so high above pre-COVID levels in Australia, in the pubs and club sector at least.
Well, it surprised us really because 2019 was shaping to be a great year. In fact, the early parts of 2020, and we fully shut down on the 23rd of March 2020, the early months of 2020 calendar were looking fabulous. So there was some strength in the market. Probably on the back of people's confidence that their housing prices, their underlying asset, had some good value in it. And then, of course, COVID hit. When we came out of COVID, yeah, absolutely. We've been trading again to some extent around Australia for, in some cases, more than 12 months. And we saw a real rush to the doors when we reopened. Right. But even now, it's still ahead of even last year when there was the rush to the door.
Okay, that's interesting. So you're in Queensland. This is Australia-wide?
Yes, I just referred to the Queensland market, but it's a little patchy around Australia. And look, I guess if you were to look at the two big states, the three big states in terms of slot operations and gaming are Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria. Now, New South Wales is recording similar, if not even more aggressive numbers than Queensland. The New South Wales numbers, for example, where there's 88,000 slots operating, the slots in hotels are a whopping 30% up on pre-COVID numbers. Clubs a little less so, 15% up. Victoria's a different story. The Victorian state was locked down pretty savagely. In fact, in some way, shape or form, the Victorian market was opened and closed and effectively was locked down almost a full year. And we see the reopening impacts really not showing the growth that we've seen in Queensland and New South Wales. I suspect that that full year of lockdown, almost a full year, really hurt the underlying businesses. And I think it probably knocked consumer confidence as well. There are anecdotes of a lot of closures of small business and a lot of small businesses struggling in Victoria. So I think that's had an impact in that state.
Yeah, interesting. That was going to be one of my questions as to, are you seeing, and we're hearing rising prices and weakening economies. It doesn't seem like that's playing through yet into the other states in Australia.
No, it's certainly not. But it's almost daily, and we're like everywhere else in the world. Almost daily, we have another set of bad news or more sets of bad news to consume. I noticed just looking at my news feeds just earlier, another building collapse, large residential building company collapsed in Victoria. And of course, that leaves, carpenters, plumbers, electricians out of pocket. And they're a key market for the slot operators in the various states and territories in Australia. We're now starting to see those price rises come through in council rates, the people who come and collect your bins, for example, and mow the footpaths. Their rates and taxes are going up by considerable margins. We're seeing electricity prices almost doubling in some cases. So, yes, petrol prices, fuel prices are going up. It's not uncommon now to be paying $2.30 for a litre of petrol, whereas once we paid $1.40 not too long ago. So all these things are trickling into the economy. But there's another thing at play here, and that is that Australians somehow miraculously accumulated something like $260 billion in additional cash savings in private bank accounts during the COVID period, $260 billion. And we're only an economy of 25 million people. That's $10,000 of extra savings, personal savings for every man, woman and child in Australia. That'll take some spending, particularly if the international tourism markets don't open up and Australians don't get to go to places like Bali and Thailand, which they love to do. So a lot of that expenditure will find its way into the domestic market. So maybe we'll absorb a little bit of that first. The other thing that's driving the economy here in Australia is underlying housing prices. And when housing prices go up, of course, people feel that they've got a great deal more wealth than they might have otherwise had. And that's fed into the confidence formula. But I think all indicators are that confidence will wane and that demand will start to quell. I'm not a doomsday merchant, but you can see some of those indicators starting to show their signs.
Sooner or later, yeah. One of the issues that we've been covering is, as the economies have opened up again, is staff shortages in the sector. Is that still an issue?
Yes, quite definitely. Front of house staff, service staff, customer-facing staff are really hard to get. There's quite a bit of research that suggests that they've flipped into a range of other different jobs, mainly retail. Retail has, of course, doesn't have the unsociable hours that some hospitality venues might have, but probably more accentuated back of house in the kitchens. Australia has had this problem with qualified cooking staff and chefs brewing for some time. It's been for over 20 years. If you look at the graph of Australians eating out, that has increased quite significantly over the last 20 and 30 years, the number of meals consumed away from the home. But at the same time, if you look at the number of apprentice chefs and qualified chefs, that's been declining. We've been moving to this situation for many years. To some extent, we put a Band-Aid over it pre-COVID. We have a thing called visa chefs. You can come to Australia and live in Australia if you're a chef, and we attracted some great chefs out of India and throughout Asia and the rest of Asia. But, of course, COVID put an end to that. And now we've got this crisis situation where a lot of my clients and a lot of clubs and pubs are shutting Mondays and Tuesdays, not offering food or offering just a very basic menu, going back to a cafe menu, for example. They can't operate functions.
Okay. And moving on to regulation now, because I know Queensland has just proposed a new raft of regulations, as has Victoria, I believe, obviously following the wake of the scandals at Crown and Star. Will they have an impact on the club sector?
Well, it heavily depends on the detail of those types of solutions and types of reforms being mooted. In Victoria, for example, or when the Commission of Inquiry was launched in Victoria and made its findings into Crown, there was some speculation both in Victoria and they're being mentioned in New South Wales that we'd have to go to some sort of gaming licence whereby you would have to show several forms of ID before you actually receive some sort of technology that allowed you to participate in gaming. And, of course, that would almost definitely hurt large parts of the market. A lot of people don't like to be tracked. They don't like to be governed in that way when it comes to the leisure activity, not for any nefarious reasons, but just simply through the concept of not giving over your personal information. So I think that if those types of regulatory initiatives are activated, you will see some impact on demand. Some other regulatory impacts or regulatory arrangements that are being mooted, for example, in the ACT, Australian Capital Territory. which is not a big market. It only has 3,500 slots in that market. But the ACT government is looking at reducing their maximum bet from $10 to $5, and they're looking at reducing the cash load up into a slot machine back down all the way down to $100 from as high as $1,000, for example, in some machines. I think that will impact on the enjoyment factor for a lot of players, and that not only are there enormous costs involved in implementing that technology for the venues, but I think it'll impact on the enjoyment factor of playing a slot machine. So to answer your question, some of these things will have an impact, some of them will have a material impact, but I think the devil's going to be in the detail.
There have also been rumblings of pointing towards the clubs. I think this was in New South Wales, that they are laundering money as much as the casinos were found to have done. Has this come across your radar? What would you say to that?
Well, there was some video footage released, it might have been a year ago now, of clear laundering activity going on in a hotel in New South Wales, I think it was. Alleged, I should say that. Now, whether that's restricted only to some hotels, some clubs, I must say that I think in my travels, I would suggest that the vast majority of hotels and clubs, and particularly clubs, because they're member-based organisations, are compliant in terms of their anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism finance requirements. But there will be some out there that are receiving some dark money and turning a blind eye to the dark money coming through the venue. And I think that, unfortunately, those rare incidents are going to accelerate us towards greater regulation and the imposition of greater technologies to try to prevent that sort of activity going on. So it's the good old story where the compliant ones eventually have to pay for the non-compliant venues. And it's a sad case, but it's true of everything.
It is a sad case. I just wanted to move on finally to talk a little bit about market demographics. I'm just wondering whether these sort of pokey halls and clubs, are they attracting the younger generation of player? Whenever I look at the growth figures in Australia, sports betting is by far and away the one that's, really showing steep growth. What do you think?
Well, Sharon, I've been doing this kind of thing for almost 30 years now. And 25 years ago, we'd go to and we'd talk at conferences and we'd attend conferences, and there'd be various people addressing the room saying that we've got this problem looming, and the problem is this, that our slot players are all over the age of 55 or 60, the majority of them are, and there doesn't seem to be any indication that a new demographic is following them. And here we are 20 years down the track, 25 years down the track, and it's interesting that that mystery has been solved. The truth is that the 18 to 35-year-old demographic, both male and female, but surprisingly male, are now in Queensland, the state that I mostly spend most of my time, demonstrates the highest participation rate in slot gaming of any other demographic group in the state. But it's a different play, where the older demographic, the mature demographic, tended to visit the venue with high degrees of frequency and stay for a longer period of time. The average bet typically was around about $1, and they would typically play for time on device. And so it was an entertainment factor. They tried to extend their budget out for a long period of time over the day, a few hours if you like, over a fairly soft gambling experience, low average bets. What we're seeing now is this new demographic emerging, the 18 to 35, and that's a fairly wide age group. But we could even narrow it down to the 20 to 28s, a little bit more male skewed, either gambling in herds, so in groups of 3, 4, and even 5 surrounding a slot machine, everyone putting in $20 or $50 into the pool and playing at the maximum bet to try to achieve the highest jackpot. You have them, high-fiving, cheering when they get the feature. And this simply didn't happen in gaming rooms 20, 25 years ago. They were subdued affairs.
Yeah.
The other style of play is, if you like, the blue-collar worker coming in, having finished work at 3:30 in the afternoon, spending only 45 minutes, putting some cash in and maximum betting and playing for the jackpot. And so it's a very different style of play compared to the time and device play that we were used to 20, 25 years ago. Now, the major beneficiary of that has been the hotel sector, hotels being far more applicable to that demographic. But certainly clubs have got an eye on trying to attract that demographic, but it's a slow process.
What kind of machines do they like to play then?
They certainly like the volatile machines, and they like the jackpot machines. A machine really doesn't have a life in the Australian market unless it's got a significant jackpot on it.
Yeah.
And now the hold and spin features are really popular, and a combination of free spin and hold and spin. And so now if you're producing a machine that doesn't have free spins and hold and spins, you're very brave indeed. And that doesn't have a significant jackpot element to it. So that's what they're playing for. And, of course, they're very, very male-oriented in terms of their design, their imagery, the sounds. So they're certainly appealing to that market.
Well, thank you very much, Geoff. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, not really, Sharon. I think it is a challenge. That market has emerged. And it is a challenge for the clubs because we do know that the hotel sector does appeal to the younger demographics. Clubs, on the other hand, have traditionally appealed to the more mature demographic. And if you go into a club, it's typically a more subdued but larger environment than a hotel. And so clubs are gazing that market and saying, well, how do we attract them? And look, it's a range of things. It's not just any one panacea that will attract that market. It's the sort of beverage that you offer, the food that you offer, the entertainment, the decor, the promotions, the culture, the dress standards as well. We have many of the clubs in Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, and the big markets will insist upon you removing your hat when you walk into the venue. Well, we see those sorts of restrictions starting to be removed in clubs, specifically to actually cater for those younger demographics. So it's a challenge. It's certainly a growth market, and clubs are really looking at it and gazing at it to try to get a slice of it.
Thank you for joining us today. Please join us every Friday for our series of interviews with thought leaders in Asia's gaming industry.